board of the Claire Booth Lewis Policy Institute, as well as president of Strategic Communications Consulting and Defend American Ideals. Coincidentally, just like our speaker last week, she immigrated from China to Oakland, which is quite a coincidence, 2 speakers in a row. However, their lives diverged a little bit. Eddie ended up in San Quentin. Ying ended up at Stanford Law School. This being Berkeley, you judge which is the better of the two. She graduated from Cornell, where she studied business and went on to get her law degree at Stanford. She wrote about her experience growing up in Oakland in a memoir called Chinese Girl in the Ghetto. And she will talk about her experience growing up and moving forward and safety from crime. Please welcome again, Ying Ma.
Okay, well, thank you all. Professor Ross, thank you for having me again. I spoke to Professor Ross's class in the spring of 2018, and whenever you get an invitation back to a class, it's always highly appreciated. If you guys are interested, you can go online and take a look at the YouTube video of my last lecture. To say that it was lively is a great understatement. Contentious is probably a more accurate adjective, but I'm thrilled to come back to Berkeley, thrilled to speak to students from Berkeley again. As Professor Ross mentioned, I grew up next door in the city of Oakland, and I grew up in a part of Oakland that was very poor, very crime-ridden, and I got there when I was 10 years old. I immigrated from communist China. I showed up without speaking English. I think I knew the ABCs, and I knew how are you and thank you, and that was about it. And my family came with very few resources. And Oakland was a big shock. And as Professor Ross mentioned, I wrote about it in my book, Chinese Girl in the Ghetto. The book chronicles my family's journey from communist China to inner city Oakland, California. And what I saw in Oakland was a great deal of lawlessness, dysfunction, the absence of personal responsibility, the failure of law enforcement to protect innocent civilians. Again, lots and lots of poverty, a downtown that smells like urine, and rampant racism, which we'll get to. But before I proceed with the rest of my talk, I do want to start on a personal note. And you know, I haven't been back to Berkeley for quite some time, and I haven't really strolled the campus for quite some time. Obviously, for those of you who grew up in the Bay Area, you know Berkeley has a big presence, a major presence in the East Bay. Can I just see a show of hands of how many of you grew up in the Bay Area? Wow, fantastic. And how many of you are immigrants? Okay. And how many of you are the first in your family to go to college? Oh, very nice, very nice. So when I was applying to college, I went to Skyline High School in Oakland. Some of you may know it. And when I was applying to college, I was the first person in my family to complete college, I guess. And I really didn't quite know what to do, how to go about it. There was nobody really to guide me. And for those of you who come from impoverished neighborhoods, I suspect there's at least a few of you here, you don't really, I think people who are from poverty don't really choose their fate. Oftentimes fate chooses you. And I remember at the time I applied to Yale University. I don't know why I thought I would get into Yale. I thought it was worth a shot, but I didn't apply to Harvard because I thought I couldn't get into Harvard. Somehow I thought that I could get into Yale. There was no logic to it. I just didn't really know the difference. I had never heard of a lot of major universities that I probably could have gotten into. I'd never heard of Claremont McKinnon, never heard of the Seven Sisters, never really heard of Dartmouth, Duke. So I didn't apply to any of those universities. I had never heard of Cornell either, but they chose me. They sent me a very pretty big brochure, and I looked at it and I thought, what the hell is this? I had never heard of the school, and I had to go and wave the brochure in front of my school counselor's face and asked her, is this actually a good university? And she kind of laughed at me and said, yes, it really is quite a good school. And so that's how I came to apply to Cornell, and I didn't apply to any other Ivy besides Cornell and Yale. But I remember the first time I showed up kind of in the Berkeley area was actually for my interview with an alum from Yale University who lived in this area, and she suggested we meet at Cafe Strata. At the time, I had never been to a cafe. I didn't know what the hell a cappuccino was. I grew up in communist China where I didn't drink coffee. I didn't like the taste of it. And so I showed up at Cafe Strata, and of course, as you guys know, having applied to universities, when you meet an alum from a university you're applying to, your goal is to impress them. And I was completely lost. She asked me what I wanted from the menu, and I looked at the menu at Cafe Strata, and I had never seen any of the options. I had no idea what I wanted. And I remember this woman was so kind. She looked like she was in her early to mid-20s, and I think she knew, maybe, and she didn't want to embarrass me. I think she knew that I had no idea what I was doing. I was a fish out of water, and so she suggested that they had all kinds of different things, and maybe I would like a mocha. And so I had never heard of a mocha, and I said, yes, that's exactly what I want. And so I got a mocha, and that was my first sort of real coffee drink from a cafe, and it was a great first coffee drink because, as you guys know, mochas are really sweet. They're not, for someone who doesn't like black coffee, mocha, for me, getting a mocha was fantastic. And so, and that was my introduction to what college life might be, that there is a world beyond the inner city, and that there are options, there are things to see in this world. And this very nice woman from Yale and I had a lovely chat. In the end, I didn't get into Yale, but I was always appreciative of how kind she was to a young lady from the inner city. And so today I had a chance to stroll around a bit, and I went back to Cafe Strata. I had lunch there, and I had a mocha. It's still very good. The cafe is pretty crowded during lunch these days. But I tell you that story because a number of you guys are from around here. A number of you guys are the first in your family to go to college, and I think for those who grew up in less than ideal circumstances, the world is very different. And I think I look around these days and I see an Oakland and a Bay Area that's very much similar to the one that I left, but at the same time it is also drastically different. In some ways it's significantly worse. And so when I was in Oakland, I had family members who were regularly punched in the face, who were held at gunpoint and robbed. I used to hear gunshots ring outside of my window when I was watching TV. I lived on the second floor of my house, and I used to see teenagers getting jumped right outside of my window. And after dark, I was always afraid to go out and take a stroll in my neighborhood. That was the Oakland I grew up in. It's a very different Oakland compared to the Oakland that my friends who lived up in the hills grew up in. But things do seem to be getting worse and worse. Now, in the intervening years since I had previously visited Professor Ross's class, we had COVID. The world seemed to have gone, it seemed as if the world had gone crazy, but we also had riots, lots and lots of riots across the country. We had what was supposed to be the racial reckoning of 2020. Many of the things that we took for granted went out the window. Public safety, that went straight out the window for a lot of major cities. Defund the police became a slogan. It became a very popular slogan. And we saw our cities burn. We saw a lot of people get away with criminal behavior, and that seemed to have become the norm. And Oakland, having never been a particularly safe city, became a place that was significantly more dangerous over time as well. But I think all of this can be contextualized in the political and cultural moment we live in, because these days we live in the moment of so-called systemic racism. There is a way to see the world, and it's propagated by a lot of people with racial grievance, and they see everything through the lens of racial grievance. There are people who are oppressors based on the color of their skin. Quite frankly, based on the color of your skin, you might have been told you were an oppressor. And based on the color of other skin colors, you were the oppressed. Now, in the middle of all of this, California also went through a very controversial political fight, and that was in 2020. We had to relitigate whether California was going to practice racial preferences in public universities, public contracting, and public employment, and that was what the Prop 16 fight was about in 2020. It just so happens that in 1996, I was involved in a political fight called Proposition 209, which was the predecessor of Proposition 16, and what 209 did was that it prohibited racial preferences to be used in public universities, public contracting, and public employment here in California. And so I am very pleased to see this very diverse classroom, because I think that as a result of Proposition 209, we prevented an entire generation of kids from being discriminated against racially in college admissions. The practice certainly was not perfect, but it's something that those of us who fought for Prop 209 are very proud of. And in 2020, there was an effort to overturn Prop 209, and a coalition of people came together and fought against it. And I'm proud to say that we prevailed in the year of racial reckoning, because the people of California, by a 13-point margin, did not want to return to racial discrimination in public contracting, public employment, or public university admissions, or public education for that matter. So the moment that we're in now, one thing that we have noticed quite a bit is that violence is often justified. And so I returned to Oakland as an example. Here are some of the statistics for Oakland's crime rate year to date, compared to 2022. You'll see that there is a slight improvement for some of the stats: homicide, rape, drastic improvement for arson, but violent crime is up significantly, over 20%. Motor vehicle theft, up over 50%. Burglary, up nearly 40%. Those are shocking numbers. Those people who live in the Oakland area, I think people feel that intimately. A number of my friends and family members who have spent decades living in Oakland constantly tell me that they don't really roam around the city of Oakland anymore. Now, these figures become actually much worse when you compare them to pre-pandemic levels. And so you'll see in this, I think these kinds of charts are always illuminating, because it gives you a trend line. And so the darker bars are representative of the figures from the post-COVID era, and you'll see that if you compare the crime rate for the different categories between the post-COVID era and the pre-COVID era, you'll see that there is a drastic increase for homicide, aggravated assault, robbery, and then the same goes for the other categories as well. And so even if you see a decrease from 2023, from 2022 to 2023, you'll see that there has been a drastic increase in the number of these categories from 2019 compared to 2023. And so if you're a resident in Oakland, particularly if you're a resident in impoverished neighborhoods, you're most affected. You're in the category of people most affected by this type of increase in crime. Now, I think, so here are some major categories just to sum up the difference between 2023 versus 2019. Again, homicide count up by almost 40%. Reported robberies up by about 30, car break-ins, that's actually become a major concern, up by over 40%, vehicle thefts. None of this is a laughing matter if you happen to live in Oakland. And then if you take a look at how Oakland compares to cities of a similar size, I thought actually Stockton was really bad. It turns out that violent crime in Oakland is much worse compared to Stockton. Sacramento is not exactly heaven on earth either. There's a lot of crime, a lot of homelessness, and in general, people like to make fun of San Francisco for having become a bit of a hellhole over the years. But Oakland's actually much, much worse than all of these other major California cities. And it's a shame. It really is a shame. And it's so much of a shame that it prompted the NAACP's Oakland branch to call on leaders, elected leaders, to declare a state of emergency on crime and to address the public safety crisis. And what they said was pretty commonsensical. You know, in their press release, they listed all the different ways that different groups of people, individuals, ethnic minorities, have been affected negatively, whether it's Asians being assaulted in Chinatown, women targeted by young mobs and viciously beaten, news crews having their cameras stolen, African Americans being disproportionately hit the hardest by crime in East Oakland and other parts of the city. And they're right, everyone is in danger. But for issuing that statement, they ended up receiving an onslaught of condemnation for daring to say that crime is something that everybody should take seriously. Now, there is a category of crime that receives precious little, I would not say attention, it receives precious little reasonable reporting and objective reporting, and that is the category of anti-Asian violence and racism. It is something that happens rampantly in Oakland, in San Francisco, in most major cities. New York City is another city that sees an enormous amount of anti-Asian violence. You guys have all seen the videos. Lots and lots of politicians began talking about anti-Asian violence during the COVID era. They condemned it. And then in recent days, months, in fact, in the last couple of years or so, many of them went silent. The problems, however, haven't actually disappeared. Let me sort of point to just some examples. In 2021, an immigrant by the name of Ying Ma, he was 61, an immigrant from China. He was pushed to the ground and kicked in the head and stomped on. And what was he doing? He wasn't exactly a privileged person. He was collecting bottles and cans for recycling in the evening after dark. He was left in a coma for months on end, for over 6 months, and then he died at the end of 2021. The man you see there is his attacker, and he was charged with a hate crime. Now, another horrific crime, anti-Asian violence in New York City. Here is a young lady who was trailed into her New York City Chinatown apartment, and she was stabbed more than 40 times. She didn't know the murderer, but this was the kind of crime that was horrific, but at the same time, it almost is so horrific that we've become somewhat desensitized to it because we've seen time and again crimes like that in the during COVID and in the post-COVID era. So this happened just last year, early last year. And then I'll bring this back closer to home in the city of San Francisco. You're seeing here a picture of an elderly woman, 91 years old. She was brutally attacked in San Francisco's Richmond district. And so what I'll do is for this one, I'll actually play you a short video. And there you go. Now, that wasn't a unique incident. Earlier this year, a 78-year-old man who was walking in downtown in San Francisco was also punched and knocked down, and he was walking with a cane. And let me also show you this brief video. Hard to watch, but I'll show you one more video. A 7th grade Asian boy who has autism, actually, viciously beaten on a bus. And so those are not isolated incidents. I think many of us have seen incidents like that happen across the country on video time and time again since COVID. And that very last video I showed you of the autistic boy being beaten, and the lady who beat her was in high school. He was in 7th grade, she was in high school. He's autistic. She probably didn't know that, but I would, that video was particularly hard for me to watch because when I used to go to high school in Oakland, I took the bus up the hill, and every single day there was, or practically every single day, there was some kind of racial slur, some kind of scuffle. Maybe not quite to that extent of what the 7th grade Asian boy faced, but along those very same lines against Asian people. And luckily for many of us, we were not autistic, and so when we saw a threat coming, we got the hell out of the way. That boy, obviously, if it were anyone else, seeing all these people screaming at him, most of us would just take our backpack out of the seat and let someone else sit there. He was autistic. He probably just didn't really quite understand the situation. But just because someone doesn't let you sit down doesn't mean that you beat them on the head time and time again. And when I went home and went to school on the bus, to Skyline High School in Oakland, I saw incidents like that. Maybe not quite exactly happening that way, but regularly, almost every single day, I saw racism like that perpetrated against Asian people. Nobody said a damn word about it. Most Asian people were afraid to say anything about it. We just got the hell out of the way. And then COVID happened, and all of a sudden our political leaders decided that it was white supremacy that was inflicting anti-Asian violence on the most vulnerable, on the elderly, on children, on women. Now, most of these crimes we are seeing on video, we see reported in the news. The most horrific violent beatings, the homicides, an older immigrant being stomped on the head, they're not committed by white people. Are there white people who are racist? Absolutely. There are plenty of racists in every single racial group. But our political leaders spent maybe 6 months to a year blaming this kind of violence on white supremacy. And then they realized they couldn't look themselves in the mirror with a straight face, continuously saying that this type of anti-Asian violence was perpetrated by white people. So you know what they did? They stopped talking about it. They tuned out. It didn't fit their political narrative. And Oakland happens to be a place where anti-Asian violence has happened for decades, and nobody gave a damn. Now, anti-Asian hate crimes nationwide, the good news is from 2021 to 2022, there was a significant decrease, but there was a drastic increase from 2020 to 2021. And then, of course, if you compare what happened from the pre-COVID era to the post-COVID era, the increase is even more significant. So, even though there was a drop in the percentage of hate crimes against Asians nationwide from 21 to 22, if you compare the crime rate from 2019 to 2022, over 150%. And this is from the FBI's data. There are a lot of different organizations spewing out different kinds of data. And I think without getting into the intricacies of how they do their research and what they count, should not count, I think the FBI is a reliable place to look for indications of how hate crimes have the hate crime trend lines have been occurring across the country. Of course, there are a lot of hate crimes that get unreported as well, but these are the crimes that we do know about. Now, before Trump, there had been waves of anti-Asian violence as well. In fact, right here in the Bay Area, about 13 years ago, so 2010, 2009, we saw a wave of anti-Asian violence in San Francisco, in Oakland, and in April of 2020, 2 black teenagers ended up punching a 59-year-old immigrant, and he died from his injuries subsequently. And the criminal said they just felt like hitting somebody. At the time, Nancy Pelosi didn't have time to say anything about it. She wasn't running around saying it was white supremacy, because back then Trump wasn't around for her to blame these crimes on him. Everybody, practically everybody in positions of elected office on the local level went around telling everybody that these crimes had nothing to do with race. The victims, as well as a lot of community groups, wanted people to at least ask, what role did race have to do with it? Why are we so afraid to talk about race, especially when, according to the San Francisco Police Department, 85% of that city's violent crimes were perpetrated by blacks on Asians. That was for a survey they did in 2008. There is great friendship between the Black community and the Asian community. I saw that when I was growing up in Oakland. You know, I think that when you're an immigrant to this country, you don't speak the language, you don't have a whole lot of resources. You remember the people who were kind to you, and there were many people who are always kind to immigrants. Simple acts of kindness sometimes go a long way. And so I think for us to simply have an honest conversation about crime is not racist, but our leaders, our community, our society, were simply afraid of it. We were afraid to have that conversation in 2010, 2009, 2008. And then the only reason we were willing to highlight anti-Asian violence for many of the national politicians was because it was politically convenient for them. And then when they could no longer say with a straight face that anti-Asian violence was largely perpetrated by white people, they decided to move on. And then the crimes have continued to occur, even though there has been some good news, which is that there's been a decrease in the last year or so. These are statistics from, again, the Department of Justice. This is from 2018, and it shows that, you'll see that basically for every racial group, the racial group that perpetrates the most amount of violent crime on that racial group is members of the same race. So white people perpetrate the most amount of violent crime on other white people, and same goes for the other ethnic groups. Except for Asians, you'll find that the group that that the Black population actually commits a higher percentage of violent crime against Asians than Asians themselves. Now, after 2018, it's been difficult to actually find any, when you have statistics like that, you want to know, well, okay, so that was pre-COVID. What happened after COVID, during COVID? These statistics were, since then, have not been made available. I asked a criminologist, am I missing something? And he said, no, you are not missing anything. They said that, you can take a wild guess on why the Department of Justice has decided not to make these statistics available. They sort of paint a very inconvenient story. And maybe somebody just doesn't want to highlight this story anymore, and so we don't have any idea what the statistics look like after COVID. I'd like to know during COVID what these numbers looked like. It would be very edifying. So we have no idea, but this is not a picture that I think many of our national political leaders, state political leaders, want you or others to see. It's certainly not a picture that they've bothered to look into. So anti-Asian violence, we saw that it happens in New York, it happens in San Francisco, it happens here in Oakland. It's oftentimes most prevalent in high crime areas, unstable communities, dysfunctional areas. It makes bystanders uncomfortable. Most of the time, bystanders say nothing, do nothing. And then the media would be afraid to point out what's happening. When you see a report of an anti-Asian violent incident, if it's a white person, the media will be very quick to point out to you a white suspect did this or that, or is allegedly did this or that to the Asian victim. If the race of the perpetrator is not mentioned, you can be sure that more likely than not, the perpetrator was probably Black or brown. It doesn't indicate that all Black people are guilty of the crime or that all brown people are guilty of the crime, but the media and our elected leaders and as a society in general, we're uncomfortable saying that, pointing that out, and so we keep our mouths shut. And then left-wing Asian American groups who claim to fight for Asian Americans, they'll sort of lump everything and anything into a hate incident. Someone says something nasty to you, it's unpleasant. Every day when I went home from school during my high school and junior high years, somebody made some sort of a racial slur against me. I assure you it was unpleasant. That's very different from being punched in the head, stomped on, beaten, robbed at gunpoint. Those are not the same types of crimes. Having someone utter a racial slur to you, that is not a hate crime. And a lot of left-wing Asian American groups have actually hauled in a great deal of money by categorizing these kinds of incidents as hate incidents. They're not okay, but they're not the same as the violent crimes that we've seen in a horrific fashion time and time again, one video after another. What can we do? I've called on Black leaders to offer leadership, to serve as a model, and I believe that many of them want to do that. My organization, Defend American Ideals, we've worked with some prominent Black leaders who have done exactly that, and we're grateful to them. Bystanders, whatever race you are, will need to speak up, but I'm not asking you to put your own personal safety at risk, because there's always a risk. However, what I've seen far too often, whether it's on the subway, on crowded subways in New York, when somebody is screaming racial epithets at an Asian person loud enough for the entire subway car to hear, and you'll find that all kinds of people who grew up with identity politics training, sensitivity training, the lawyers, the bankers, the people who make 7 figures a year, they'll just stand there and look. They will say nothing. I think there have been isolated incidents when people have piped up recently. We've seen that on video, but more often than not, in most public places, people say nothing. I think part of what we should remember is that the violent incidents don't happen sort of in an isolated context. If you live in a community where it's okay for people to just randomly utter racial epithets at another racial group and nobody says anything, maybe you shouldn't be surprised that when somebody is stomping an Asian person on the head, that they're also uttering racial epithets. I think as a society, we need to make sure that we say that that's not okay. We need more honesty in public discourse. That's a more long-term goal. And I would also ask for your help. You guys are the future leaders of this country. Most students at Berkeley, we're told that you tend to lean left. Maybe you do, but Berkeley has historically also had one of the largest college Republican chapters in the country. I don't really know what your politics are. It doesn't matter to me. I do believe that a lot of young people want to do good, whether you're left or right. And so I would ask for your help that when you see incidents like that in the future, step up to the plate. But don't put your own personal safety at risk. The last thing I want to see is another individual get hurt. But there are all kinds of situations where you don't have to put your personal safety at risk and you can speak up. Because I suspect that most of you, if you see a Black person being subjected to racial epithets from a white person, that you would speak up. And so I would ask the same if you see an Asian person subjected to racial epithets, an onslaught of racial epithets, and I see that time and time again in urban areas, heavily urban areas that are heavily Democratic. And then I would say, I think we need to fight crime in general, because the way I started this presentation was to talk about how crime affected everybody. And I gave Oakland as an example, the enormous rise in crime, violent crime in Oakland in the last few years or so. And we need to fight crime in general for everybody, because as the I would just go back to a statement made by the NAACP not long ago, and they said there is nothing compassionate or progressive about allowing criminal behavior to fester and rob Oakland residents of their basic rights to public safety. It is not racist or unkind to want to be safe from crime. And I think that's something we should remember. And no one should live in fear in our city, and I hope that no one should live in fear in our country and in the state of California. So I see that I have gone on for probably a bit too long. There's, what, 5 minutes left for questions? Okay, okay, thank you all.
Real loud.
You spent a lot of time in your presentation focusing on how a lot of anti-Asian criminal violence is perpetrated by black people. So would you recommend that these people use police more aggressively and like a larger police presence for black people, especially in proximity to Asian people?
Here's what I would recommend. I would recommend a larger police presence in cities that are unsafe. And so one of the concerns you'll hear from citizens, so let me give you an example. Recently, you guys might have heard that a lot of small businesses in Oakland closed down. They went on strike, and it was a protest against crime. And many of these small business owners, what they asked for was, amongst other things, a bigger police presence. I think that many major cities in America have kind of gone through radical changes in law enforcement, and that many of the most unsafe areas in the country, in fact, need a heavier police presence. So what I'm advocating is not that you should go police black people more, or that you should target one race over another, but that if there is criminal behavior, if there's a higher crime percentage in certain neighborhoods, then offer protection. I mean, what we've seen across California, many major Californian cities, is that criminals have kind of been running amok. There's a lot of theft and retail stores being robbed, and criminals sort of cycle in and out of, so let's say if you commit retail theft and it's under $950, it's no longer considered a felony, it's a misdemeanor. And there are a number of other measures that make it easier, and it makes it less of an offense to commit the crimes. And so I think we should target those incentives that we have provided for criminals to commit crimes. Let's take away those incentives. Let's provide a heavier police presence in those neighborhoods and communities that need them. So for instance, if Chinatown is an area where a lot of crime occurs, then go increase the police presence in Chinatown.
Still right here.
Yeah, so I have two major points. The first being that post-COVID crime is on the rise in general, not necessarily specifically to the Asian community. And second, in the table where you were referring to white on white versus black on black and the different racial ethnicities of people committing crimes and their victims, the reason why you see a white on white crime being the most is because that is the popular, that is the people inside of their community. So it's not that white people hate white people the most, and that's why.
Well, that's not what in fact, I'm agreeing with you. So what I'm saying is that usually you see people within the same race commit more crimes against each other because they know each other better. And when you know someone better, you're likely to have disputes with them. So in those racial categories that I showed you, white people committed more crimes against violent crimes. Black people committed the most, violent crimes against other black people and so on. What I was showing you about the statistics for Asian people was that was the anomaly amongst the different racial groups, and that the group that committed the highest percentage of violent crimes against Asian people, at least for the year 2018, according to these stats from the Department of Justice, was that black people committed the highest percentage, and that was the anomaly. So I'm actually agreeing with your analysis. When it comes to post-COVID crimes, I'm agreeing with you as well. I'm not arguing that crime is only happening to Asian people. I'm saying actually that crime, what we've seen certainly is crime has gone up generally, and that you've seen that a lot in major cities, New York City, San Francisco, but that one group of people that has been affected significantly has been Asian people, and that anti-Asian violence is one of the most horrific categories of crime that we have seen.
So right here.
Yes.
To your recommendation about having
Feel loud.
to your recommendation of having a bigger police presence, it sounds similar to like broken windows policing, but can you cite an example of where that's had the outcomes you want in any other city?
Any other city? Well, look, take a look at Giuliani's New York City. The way that they policed New York City during the Giuliani and Bloomberg years was precisely using the broken window theory. And that crime rate went down significantly during the Giuliani and Bloomberg years. When it comes to what's happening, what we do know is that, so for example, in many of the cities where we've seen crime go up during the COVID years, the police presence has gone down because a number of big cities did go through a phase where they defunded the police force came down, and then there were, we kept hearing stories and reporting about how a lot of the officers who were still on the police force felt that they didn't want to stick their neck out anymore. And then a number of these cities also went through a phase where they realized how much of a problem that was because crime rates went up drastically, and a number of them sort of refunded the police. And so what we do know is that when police presence has not been sufficient, we have seen the crime rate go up. Now, I get that there is police reform that needs to happen, and that certainly not all police officers are angels, and that there are institutional elements that need to change. But it doesn't mean that you should get rid of the entire police force. And I think if you look at Asian communities, so let me give you an example. Chinatown. They are not asking the police to please stay away. I think in general, places with heavy Asian business presence, heavy Asian populations, they would be very happy if there's a higher police presence, right? And so for those communities, it is not controversial. I understand that there are other communities where there's, a controversy about, do we want more police, less police? What is, the nature and history with the police in general? And I think that's a conversation worth having. But just to narrow this down, if you have communities that are saying, we would like a heavier police presence, and that's not a controversy, let's just do that. Let's just do that. And I think that, for the elderly who are being attacked, and I just showed, what I showed was just a few videos. There are many, many other videos of the elderly being attacked. They are not going to be carrying a gun. They're not going to take self-defense classes. They can't defend themselves. The only way that those people can defend themselves is if able-bodied men and women can defend them. And who are those able-bodied men and women? Usually they're supposed to be the police. We've seen some communities kind of organize citizens groups, and those are very helpful too. We've certainly seen that in New York City's Chinatown. But that's not going to be the end-all and be-all of the solution.
I see a lot of hands up. Unfortunately, it is 5 o'clock, so we have to end the class. Come on down. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.